Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, peace be upon you. I'm Amira, the Islamic Awareness Chair in ISOC, and I'd like to welcome you all to our first Experience Islam event. I'm sure everyone, myself included, are impatient to hear what our honoured speaker, Carla Power, has in store for us today. But first, let me give you a brief insight into what we have in store for you all this week. The Oxford University Islamic Society is proud to present its unique Experience Islam Term 2016, an annual initiative with a range of diverse and engaging events, all pertaining to Islam, designed to entertain and inform. Individually, we all have our own understanding of Islam. Mine, as a Muslim, will be different to somebody else's. And we should tap into that. We should engage in debate, conversation with each other, and fuel and satisfy our curiosity, which is what we are aiming to achieve this week. This week of events ranges from a talk by Saqib Ashraf on the Qur'an, its composition and history, its place in the lives of Muslims. Thursday marks a speech by Lauren Booth talking about her experiences since accepting Islam and what it really means to be a Muslim, especially as a woman in the Western world. We are also fortunate to have royalty, Prince Ghazi bin Muhammad of Jordan, to speak about what is happiness from a religious perspective. Of course, we can't cover everything, but the cultural fair on Saturday at the Town Hall aims to illustrate the rainbow of cultures, exemplifying the diversity represented in Islam. Students will be present, giving you an insight into things like the hijab and its place in a woman's life, Islamic art, and we even have some poetry to entertain you all. Our finale event will be in true Oxford style, held at the Oxford Union, which will be a head-to-head with our very own Professor Tariq Ramadan and Mariam Namazi on the title of Islam in Europe Today. Now on to tonight's event. No Experience Islam event will be complete without a talk on the Qur'an. Carla Power, a journalist specializing in Muslim societies, global social issues and culture, is the author of If the Oceans Were Ink, an unlikely friendship and a journey to the heart of the Qur'an, an account of her year spent studying with the traditional Islamic scholar Sheikh Mohammad Akram Nadwi. In If the Oceans Were Ink, Carla goes beyond the headlines to understand the worldview of a prominent British-based Islamic scholar. Oceans probes issues of migration, faith, and explores the possibility of tolerance in a world wrapped with intolerance. A finalist for this year's National Book Award in the United States, If the Oceans Were Ink is a lively, accessible work aimed at the general reader, while sketching out Sheikh Nadwi's thoughts on life. Carla herself writes for the Time magazine and is a former correspondent for Newsweek, where she produced award-winning stories reporting from Europe, Middle East, and Asia. Her essays have appeared in a wide range of publications from Vogue, the Oprah magazine, to the New York Times, The Guardian, and Foreign Policy. Carla Power holds an MPhil from St Anthony's College here at Oxford in Modern Middle Eastern Studies, as well as degrees from Yale and Columbia. Married with 2 children, she has kindly given up her time for us today. Today, Carla will do a reading from her book with a short speech afterwards, to which will follow a brief Q&A session. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Mrs. Carla Power.
Thank you, Amira, and thank you, and to Nabila and to Imran for such a lovely welcome here. I'm really honored to be part of what sounds to be an amazing lineup of speakers for this week. And I also want to thank Faisal Muhammad of the Cambridge Islamic College, who helped put this together as well. It's a thrill to be back at Oxford, where I first, I first started studying sort of Islamic societies from an anthropological perspective with Michael Gilson in here, and remember sweating through my finals and my mods here, so it's much calmer to be here now, having got through all that. If it's okay, I'll just start off with a bit of a reading, and then talk a little bit. But I thought for this particular audience, it would be fun to do to write about Sheikh Mohammad Akram Nadwi's first years in Oxford, when I first knew him back at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies in the early 90s. I'm sure as die-hard Oxfordians, you will recognize some of the scenes and guises in this particular excerpt. This is from a chapter called A Migrant's Prayer Mat. When I worked at the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies in the early 90s, it was a flimsy prefab building off a back street in Oxford, not the sort of place I associated with giddiness of any sort. But one spring day it seemed to hum. A tent had been erected, a red carpet unrolled, and fruit juices and cookies ordered. For on that day a prince was due, Prince Charles, or as the Centre newsletter would call him, His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, was to visit. The Centre's administrators had spent weeks in preparation. Invitations were printed, caterers engaged, the phone lines were clogged, and fax machines spat out security clearances. All this bemused Akram, as did the breathless speculations of the young secretaries planning the event. The day itself had the vibe of a costume party for well-connected old men. Oxford dons assembled in their black academic gowns. Limousines from London disgorged mustachioed Arabs in flowing white thobes, the Gulf's traditional ankle-length gowns. British businessmen with slicked-back hair and tailored suits consulted one another in clumps, craning their necks, searching, in vain, for the sherry. When the prince and his entourage arrived, a hush fell and heads bobbed in uncertain half-bows. Not Akram's. He stood ramrod straight in his grey caracol cap and his sherwani, the buttoned black frock coat that is the traditional garb of an Indian alim. Standing a few paces back from the red carpet, he watched the prince mingle with courtiers. I was awed at Akram's cool. Like many scholars before him, he believed that the ulama should stay independent from royal courts of any kind. But his dignity derived from somewhere deeper, I later realized. It wasn't just that he was unmoved by office politics or royal celebrity. Islam, for him, flattened worldly hierarchies. There was just a single power he cared about, God's. To behave differently just because someone is weaker or stronger than ourselves, he wrote, implies a weak understanding of our equality as being the creatures of the Creator. His imperviousness to Prince Charles was particularly impressive since he'd grown up in living memory of British rule in India. Born in 1963, he spent his childhood on a subcontinent where Britain and its royals still commanded considerable respect. When his own sheikh, the principal of Nadwat al-Ulama, had selected him to go take up a fellowship in Oxford, Akram agreed, not because of Britain, but because of his obedience to his sheikh. He was a slave of God. In Akram's world, when your sheikh asked something of you, you did it, provided it didn't interfere with your faith. During his first autumn abroad, Lucknow was very far away indeed. He bought a bus pass and a bicycle and applied for a reader's card at the Bodleian. He invested in stout shoes and a parka to withstand the British winter. He borrowed books on Christianity from the Oxford Public Library, and he was shocked to read the way people wrote about Jesus, either as a god or just as another human being, he told me. In the spring, when Lucknow's famous mangoes ripened, he found an Oxford supermarket selling them and bought every last one. He found a halal butcher and taught himself to cook Lucknowi yakni pulao. At the mosque in North Oxford, his prayers felt the same, of course, but he couldn't help missing his Lucknow routine. At Nadwa, he'd follow his dawn prayers with a stroll beside the Gumti River, debating Greek logic with friends or discussing how the Arabic grammar schools of Kufa differed from Basra's or Baghdad's. At Nadwa, worship and religious study had shaped the days into a continuum of faith. In Oxford, his fellow worshippers prayed and left, rushing off to their classes or their taxis or their corner stores. Once, when I asked him what he missed most about Lucknow, he responded, true friendship. He may have missed Lucknow, but he lived in Britain without an ounce of self-pity. His self-discipline was prodigious, this man who would pray deep into the night, then rise before dawn to pray again. Once I called him on his mobile and found him on a bus to London. "I'm going to the eye hospital," he told me. He'd had a headache that had lasted for several weeks. "Weeks?" I asked. "But how have you managed to work?" "It's not so very bad," he said. "It's painful, but I can still read." Just then, for example, he was rereading Ibn Taymiyyah. Once, the Atlas team, a team we worked together on a project mapping the spread of Islam in South Asia. The Atlas team went down to London for a day to look at the antique map collection at the India Office Library. We watched as a white-gloved curator unfurled a yellow strip of paper, which turned out to be a Mughal strip map showing the road between Delhi and Kandahar. Whereas standard maps show places in relation to one another in a plain, this one showed a road, and almost nothing but the road. 2 elegant lines in spindly black ink. It included the occasional marker, a boulder or a tree, a shrine or a town. These were signposts, but the road was the real thing. What lay beyond it was of little concern. It was a map for a traveler who chose not to indulge in his peripheral vision, for someone who had no use for distractions. That, I remember thinking, is a map for a man like Akram. So, that's another person newly arrived at Oxford. I guess if I could, I'll talk a little bit now as a journalist, because I'm sure there are many people in this room who are far better versed than I in Islamic studies. But I can offer a journalist perspective of coverage and thinking about how to write about Islam for a popular audience. I'll kick off with an anecdote that the great cultural critic Edward Said used to love to tell about the 1930s comedian Groucho Marx. And evidently the comedian was on holiday in Italy, and he found himself in an elevator with a bunch of Catholic priests. And one of them turns to Groucho Marx and says, "Oh, Mr. Marx, it's such a pleasure to meet you. My mother is a huge fan of your work." And Marx turns to him and said, "Huh, I didn't know you guys were allowed to have mothers." So, and Said told the anecdote in the context of a discussion of how Muslims are often portrayed in the media, that the loudest voices about Islam are the ones on news pages. This is at the expense of all the other facets of culture, faith, belief, diversity, and so on. So the Groucho Marx mother problem, as I've decided to call it, is certainly a familiar one for me as a non-Muslim journalist. As I'm sure everyone here knows, the mainstream press too often casts Islam and Muslims in terms of issues, of political conflicts, or veils, or voting blocs, or yes, particularly here in Europe, as problems to be solved in terms of integration or security, or even, say, in France, as affronts to the nation's sense of self. However, Muslims as people with mothers and work deadlines and crushes and nut allergies and cravings for pints of Ben & Jerry's and teenagers who ask for the keys to the car, they're too often absent from mainstream representation, crowded out by images of suicide bombers and jihadis. The parade we all sadly know makes the news pages of Middle Eastern strongmen and muffled and silent women. And since 9/11, and particularly since last spring, since the rise to prominence of what unfortunately has come to be known as the Islamic State, the mainstream media have been locked into what's been kind of a ghastly dance with the jihadis, where it is often these violent outliers who are presented over and over again as representative of Islam. We see this on endless loop with the same stock characters. And as the media, I think we're co-conspirators in this. ISIS beheads a Western journalist or tweets incendiary anti-Western slogans, and we give them just the coverage they were aiming for. Gunmen massacre Parisians, and we obligingly make them poster men for jihadi bad boys. The 24-hour news cycle means that the quiet and the peaceful aren't heard. The old journalistic rule of thumb, sort of if it bleeds, it leads, holds for all peoples. It's depressingly democratic. But in the case of representation of Muslims, it's much more so because the scenes of blood and war are so rarely counterbalanced by any other narratives to flesh out Islam and Muslims in other facets. What are the chances, say, of a woman in hijab making it onto the cover of Vogue, or a feature in Condé Nast Traveler on the best places to stay in Mecca when you go on Umrah, or a piece in a workout magazine on how prostrating for Muslim prayers lowers your blood pressure and makes you more limber? I'm stretching the point somewhat, but it is a useful thought experiment. What I do know is that the violent extremists have figured out ways of staying in the Western headlines, and the rest of the world's 1.6 billion Muslims, by and large, haven't. I had an interesting situation a couple of months back when I had pitched a story about a group of Muslim feminist activists and scholars who had devoted a whole book to verse 434, which has, as you probably all know, is cited as the legal justification for male authority over women in the Muslim world. It's the backbone of the Saudi Arabian mahram law. And when a Nigerian wife, reluctantly agrees to allow her husband to take a second or third wife, it is the common interpretation of that verse that allows, that is cited. So a study that parsed 434 as a definitive verse, which had taken years and years and scores of researchers supervised by the top names in the Islamic women and feminist movements. And they parsed the verse grammatically, they parsed it historically, they looked at the development and its use in faith. And they came out arguing that it was interesting that this was the verse that was argued as the pivotal one, as opposed to other verses that talk about marriage in a very different way, in a more egalitarian way, that stress marriage as, say, a matter of mutual support or respect and cooperation. And they were arguing that privileging this verse over the other verses that stress love and mutual support was very much a man-made interpretative act. So to me, as a journalist, watching lots of Muslim activists across Muslim societies debate about framing marriage and divorce and inheritance law, it seemed to me a critical publication that at least deserved serious coverage in Time magazine. And an event that was arguably more newsworthy than yet more coverage of a suicide bombing or a hate crime. But my editor didn't see it that way. He said it wasn't news. The piece was relegated to the sort of calmer backwater of the ideas section. And of course the great irony is, if these women had blown something up, they would have landed on the news pages. But instead, they were in just ideas, as though ideas didn't have sufficient power to change what is news. Lest I come off as a self-loathing journalist, I'd like to say that the shorthand required by the pressures of being in the mainstream media, which is of course powered by events rather than by nuance or subtle debates, is pretty ill-suited, in particular to concepts that come from outside Western parlance. And in the case of the Islamic world, events have more than ideas, have sort of shaped Western concepts of Islam. I mean, if you think, say, of the Ayatollah Khomeini's fatwa against Salman Rushdie, that has sort of, for example, for millions and millions, has made fatwa synonymous with death sentence, as opposed to, you know, a non-binding religious opinion. So sadly, because of this event-driven kind of framing of the news, it means that the trumpetings of Islamic radicals and Western Islamophobes alike have managed to help conflate cultural traditions practiced in the Muslim world, such as FGM or barriers to keep women from the freedom to work or to get educated. And they have managed to conflate this too often with Islam itself. I sort of, as a journalist, I had sort of 3 stages of trying to write responsibly about Muslim societies. I certainly covered, you know, news-related events, so I ran around and interviewed, you know, people about Osama bin Laden and about jihadi networks and so on. And that was for the news pages of I was at Newsweek then. And then I tried to sort of widen the bandwidth a little bit by trying to do feature pieces. And that allowed for a little bit more wiggle room. I would write on, you know, Pakistani Sufi bands, or, you know, rock bands, or, you know, the halal economy, or European Muslim professionals. And that was better than a sort of headline-driven thing. But it also occurred to me that it certainly wasn't trying to see Islam from a Muslim's perspective in a real deep and meaningful way. I mean, never once in sort of 17 years was I ever asked to look at the Qur'an or report on what verses or what readings of hadith were shaping, you know, events. And there was also a sense when I did these, you know, well-meaning sort of fluff pieces, there was also a sense that it was a bit like the, you know, the magazines when you check out at the supermarket and there are, you know, pictures of celebrities doing things like sipping lattes or hauling their kids around on their, and there was a sort of sense of trying to slot Muslims into our worldview. So Muslims are just like us. They, you know, they drink halal energy drinks and they invest in the stock market. They're, you know, just like Brad and Angelina are just like us. So there was this kind of flattening effect that had, and it wasn't until I approached Sheikh Akram about really trying to understand his worldview and sort of trail him around for a year and dog his family, as Aisha and Fatima sitting there will attest, and follow him around as he went to the gym or the mosque or off on Umrah. That I really tried to set aside these kind of journalistic frameworks and enter, admittedly, another one, which was a longer, more immersive conversation, a sort of listening exercise. And again, as a journalist, thinking about this sort of post 9/11 framework, I'm old enough to have been raised to think of Watergate as a watershed in how one is a journalist, which is a kind of gotcha journalism, which works very well when you're trying to, you know, keep democracy safe and so on. When it works well with public figures, when you're pressing somebody and you know, doing a kind of Jeremy Paxman and trying to get to that. I think it works less well in a kind of, we need to think of new ways as journalists to cover other societies, because that kind of gotcha stuff just doesn't work. We have to think, in a sense, we have to be much, much better listeners. And so and trying again and again and again to understand the other's point of view. And this isn't stressed, I think, often in journalist training, where the notion is there is a truth and you will get at it, and there is a government official hiding it from you. It's a very different thing than if you're trying to understand and explain to a broad public about probably sit more comfortably with my own. I could have chosen to study with an Islamic feminist, one of the growing number of pioneers who are going back to traditional sources to argue for gender equality in the text. And I could have sat with legal scholars who were attempting to hammer out laws for Muslims living as minorities in the West, but I didn't. I didn't want to walk into a hall of reflecting mirrors. I was embarking on this in an increasingly polarized world between rich and poor, Republican and Democrat, and yes, Muslim and non-Muslim. And I wanted this to be a listening exercise, sitting sometimes for 8 hours on weekends, as if there are any other of his students here in his Qur'an lectures, and trying to empathize with a worldview completely different from my own. The idea was to work as a sort of cultural cartographer, charting where our worldviews overlapped and where they didn't. I wanted to map out what divided us and what united us. I'd be hard-pressed to find someone less like myself than Sheikh Mohammad Akram Nadwi. I am a secular humanist feminist raised by a non-practicing Quaker father and a mother who was raised Jewish, but whose involvement was limited to Passover Seders and dim memories of the dreidel song. Sheikh Mohammad Akram is Indian-born. He was raised in a village in Uttar Pradesh, spending days in the local mosque school, evenings taking his family's water buffalo to be watered, and nights reading the stories and poem from Sa'di, the 13th century Persian poet, by kerosene lamp. His brilliance propelled him from his village to the prestigious madrasa Nadwat al-Ulama in Lucknow, from whence his own sheikh sent him here to Oxford to work at the Center for Islamic Studies. And we met there when we were both in our 20s, working together on a project mapping out the spread of Islam in South Asia. And he made his name at first as a scholar of hadith. About 10 years ago, he sort of put together his magnum opus, which is Al-Muhadithat, his work on Islamic women scholars. And I remember him telling me one day, he's like, "Oh, you're interested in women's issues. I'm doing women hadith scholars. I think it'll be a slim volume. I'll be done in a month or two, 20 or 30 names." And of course, now he's more than 40 volumes, and over 9,000 names, and arguably a real illumination of what one thinks of as Islamic scholarship and who does it. It was his support of women's learning, I suspect, that helped my case when I proposed that we engage in this conversation. When I asked him whether he would sit and let me follow him around, he said, "You're right. Your audience would never be allowed to hear from an ulama." And he knew that as a traditional madrasa-trained scholar, his views would be unknown to a non-Muslim mainstream audience like my own. And this, of course, despite the fact that he was far better versed in Islamic traditions and history than many of the self-styled Muslim authorities that make the news. So he embarked on what, for an intensely private man, would be a tremendously cumbersome and invasive year, with me perched on the couch watching him as he was father to his 6 daughters, trailing him around to his lectures. And we spent lots of times in mosques and coffee shops and the Oxford kebab shop down the Cowley Road, going over verses in the Qur'an. But we also brought our daughters together for meals, and indeed, because our mothers died within 10 days of each other, mourned the loss of our parents together. When I started, and I told people I'm studying with a Muslim scholar, the first thing non-Muslims will want to know usually is, what kind of Muslim scholar? A moderate, they'll ask, or a fundamentalist? Or sometimes, is he liberal or is he conservative? The terms vary, the subtext doesn't. Is he one of us or is he one of them? This is the language I'm afraid we're left with after the trauma of recent decades. It's now only too easy to slot people into the neat grooves worn by the media and the clash of civilizations crowd. The more I studied with the Sheikh, though, the less helpful I found all the available labels, both Western and Muslim. What is the Sheikh, anyway? He's a traditionally trained scholar who scandalizes conservatives and disappoints progressives, and sometimes just the reverse. A champion of women's rights who accepts that Islam allows polygamy, and who, until quite recently, when two of his brightest women students challenged him, would not issue a blanket condemnation of child marriage. He's a defender of individual conscience, but not Western-style individualism. I'd introduce him to Islamic feminist activists I knew, and they'd come back and they'd say, he's lovely, but he's very conservative, isn't he? And online, I'd read others charging him with being liberal and westernized, since he had issued fatwas allowing women to learn with men to go to the mosque. At issue, frequently, was his clear-eyed attempt to separate what was cultural from what is mandated by Islam itself. So when, for example, he issued a fatwa saying that it's fine for women to cut their hair short, on the grounds that the Prophet Muhammad's wives cut off their hair after his death, and if it was acceptable for them, it was acceptable for 21st century women, he was criticized because some scholars thought that it was an example of him being modern or Western. But of course, like the 9,000 women scholars he found, the Sheikh's arguments for freedom from haircuts was not derived from imported Western ideologies, as his detractors might claim, but he found it firmly within the Islamic tradition itself. I know this firsthand because sometimes I go to him with feminist interpretations that I was hopeful he'd agree with, and he'd take a dim view of them. One progressive interpretation that I'd heard in Malaysia, actually, that the verse about polygamy descended to the Prophet Muhammad after battles in which Muslim men were killed, leaving lots of widows who needed caring for. And so I'd heard some Malaysian feminists saying that the idea behind polygamy is not to get a sexy young trophy wife, but rather to care for women who were older and widowed, and who in traditional societies like 7th century Arabia might not otherwise had the chance for protection by a man, which was very important then. And so I'd go to him hopefully with this interpretation, and he'd say, nope, they just want to make Islam sound better to the non-Muslims. No, that isn't the reason. So he wasn't going to be drawn when he couldn't find it in his own sources. Our year together, in some ways, was a case of kind of lopsided interest. I was tremendously curious about his worldview and eager to engage in it. And he, while endlessly generous and interested in my family and what I was writing, was not particularly interested in my secular worldview, or so I thought. Toward the end of our lessons, we had a last lesson at the Ashmolean Museum, which, I don't know if you've seen it, it's got a beautiful Persian tile in the Islamic, one of the Islamic rooms, depicting a scene from Yusuf and Zuleika based on the Quranic story of Yusuf. And now, I knew that Muslims didn't approve of images of the Prophet, so I wasn't expecting him to be in raptures over it, necessarily. But I did find myself being a little surprised that he strode past a Michelangelo on his left and a Fra Angelico painting on his right, and ignored even the Islamic tiles in the room where we were having our lesson. And for a secular humanist like me, who looked to art or nature or connections with other people to find the holy, I found myself feeling almost rather hurt that he had paid no attention to all this gorgeousness around him. There was, perhaps slightly pathetically, an element of show and tell in me, some need for approval or at least some curiosity. And just for a second, I wanted him to take a step towards my worldview as I tried to do with his. And when I thought about it, he actually had. By the standards of his upbringing in Uttar Pradesh, in a household where Purdah was observed so strictly that brothers and sisters and fathers and daughters didn't talk to one another, the fact that he was sitting in Oxford talking to a non-believer woman about everything from the fires of hell to sex to death to Israel to jihad to parenting tactics, what was this if not my own precious pluralism in action? If the closest thing that I hold to a religion is the preciousness of reaching out to others, however unlike oneself they may seem, Akram had allowed me to really test my bedrock beliefs. And if understanding difference is among my key values, it's also a Quranic one. Only through diversity, says the Qur'an, can you truly learn the shape of your own humanity. The famous verse, O humankind, we created you from a male and a female, and we made you races and tribes for you to get to know each other. And it is only through this knowing that we can know ourselves. So thank you. Thank you.